So thank you very much for that introduction. And yes, today I want to tell a bit of a story about what's happening up at the northern reaches of our planet in the Arctic that's undergoing rapid warming. And the question was posed, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And I think one way to answer that question is it all depends on your perspective. So if you are a tundra shrub, life is looking good at the moment. If you're other parts of the biodiversity of those systems, perhaps not. So you can form your own opinion on whether it's a good or a bad thing as we move through the talk. Excellent. Wondering whether it wants to change slides here. Okay. So I wanted to start with this, which is a bird's eye view of the tundra. And if you're online on Zoom, it might be a bit staticky, but it's actually a video. So this is the biome that I study, the tundra ecosystems. And I wanted to drive home at the very beginning of this talk what lies underneath that very thin layer of green that you see in our northern reaches of our planet. And so at the site that I work at, Kikiktarak Herschel Island, which I'll tell you a bit about across this talk, underneath those plants is a huge amounts of frozen soil, the permafrost. And so this video is sort of showing you, it's filmed from a drone, what that permafrost looks like when it's been exposed by disturbances. So we have here what you would call a retrogressive thaw slump, which is one of the bigger permafrost disturbance features that you see up in the Arctic. That individual slump that you saw there is the third biggest in the Arctic, we think. And so that little video sort of drives home the message maybe for you that the Arctic is warming a lot. So it's warming and we keep having to change the statistics. So nowadays we're saying it's warming at 4 times the rate and 4 times the magnitude of the rest of the planet. A couple of years ago, we were saying 2 times, then we started saying 3 times. So and you can just imagine that acceleration of change that's going on in these high latitudes. So each season, there's progressively more heat in these systems, and that heat is causing things like the permafrost to thaw, and it's having impacts on those tundra ecosystems. And that's what I'm going to sort of run you through in the talk today, what different responses there are from those tundra ecosystems to that climate change. And often in an Arctic climate change talk, the focus is on charismatic megafauna like the polar bear. But I want to flip the perspective a bit and put it on the charismatic mesoflora like Areophrum vaginatum, cotton grass, beautiful, fluffy white, very similar to a polar bear. But in this case, Areophrum tends to be doing better at some sites as things warm. And I want to take you to my primary Arctic field research site, which is called Kikiktarak, and it's that's the word in the Inuvialuktun language, and it means the island, and it is, as you can see, an island sitting off the Arctic coast of the Yukon Territory. So it's right next to the border with Alaska and the very, very far northwest of Canada. And it's the only island along that coastline, which is why it gets the title, The Island. And it's an amazing place to work. So one reason is because I have often an amazing team out there. So this is our team photo from not this summer, but last summer. And, you know, have a look, see if you can spot the trick. It takes a while to put together this photograph, thus we haven't quite got the one from this summer together, but this summer there's more hot pink in the uniform. And we have a lot of fun out there, but we're also hopefully collecting some really important data that are capturing those tundra ecosystem responses to warming. And we're not doing that alone as Team Shrub, we're doing it in collaboration with the Inuvialuit people and the park that is the place where we're working. So Kikiktarak is a territorial park run by the Yukon government, and it's co-managed with the Inuvialuit people. And so this is some of the park rangers and some of my team looking down on the tundra, trying to figure out what's going on a transect that's there to monitor the timing of plant growth phenology. And this transect and these data are going to reappear at multiple points during the talk. And I want to place a picture up on the slide here to get you to think about what your perceptions are of the Arctic. So I think a lot of people's perceptions might sort of be echoed in this photograph. This is from Ellesmere Island, and I got to visit this site called Alexandra Fjord in 2018, which is another place where there's a long-term ecological monitoring program. And we're way up the valley at the edge of this glacier here, and you see a lot of rocks and ice, but not so much in the way of plants. And that might be our perceptions of what the tundra biome looks like as a whole. But what I would like to try and convince you of today is at least parts of the tundra biome are quite biodiverse. So there's, this is back to Kikiktarik where I work. In a meter squared plot, you might have 20 to 30 vascular plant species and 40, 50 non-vascular plant species, all within that 1 meter squared. So that's really high diversity. That's on par with grasslands in the UK or in the rest of Europe. So it's not the sort of barren landscape necessarily that some people might think. So there's a lot of biodiversity that's very adapted to those cold conditions. And when things warm, for some of those species, they're moving out of the ranges and the climate conditions that they're adapted to. So what happens when that goes on? So one of the ways we can get at that question is by using long-term data sets. So going back to those meter squared plots over time and monitoring changes that we see in those tundra ecosystems. And on Kikiktarik, we have this wonderful opportunity to do that because these systems have been monitored since around 1999, so not as long as the Linnean Society has been in existence, unfortunately. But for a tundra ecosystem, that's a pretty decent length of time series. And there's various groups working at sites around the Arctic that have been doing monitoring from the 1980s and 1990s through to now. So we have a decent picture of change that's going on at sites around the tundra biome. And just to give you a feel of what that data collection is like, some of my team love it, some of my team are less fond of the days that we have to do point framing. So that's what's being shown here. So we put down a meter squared plot. That meter squared plot has a grid marked across it with a pink string you can see there, 100 points in the grid. And we drop a metal pin at every one of those 100 points. And then we record every plant part of every plant species that the pin touches. So that's everything down to that tiny root that you can see touching the pin there. Nowadays, we do it with iPads, so it's all straight to digital, because before that, you had to spend hours entering the data afterwards. Each plot takes around 1 to 2 hours, maybe longer to monitor. And so at this site, we're monitoring 12 plots, and we monitor them every year. So it takes 3 to 4 days if things are going well. So it's a tedious time commitment, but the data that are produced are amazing. And they do, if you do this over time, give us this picture of how things are changing at that plot scale. But I would say there's another thing you have to deal with when you're doing your Arctic research, and that would be mosquitoes. So this is me at the plots with the iPad in my hand and a mosquito taking a drink of my eyebrow. So if we put all those data together and we analyze them, here are from the sites around the Arctic, here are the signals that we see. So we see winner and loser species, and we also see winner and loser plant functional groups. And so in this figure, it's at the plant functional group scale. And so you've got different colors that are representing different groups. So the brown is the bare ground, and we're seeing that decrease in bare ground, so a loss of bare ground in these systems, and more plants. In terms of more plants, what we're seeing the greatest increases of are tundra shrubs, so then the blue or the green bars there, but also to a certain extent graminoids, sometimes the forb species, and sometimes we're seeing a loss of mosses, occasionally lichens. It's site-specific there. But in general, there are some species that are winning out as things warm and other species that aren't doing as well. And if we put all that information together and just ask the question, how is tundra biodiversity changing at these sites all around the Arctic? And so you can see the sites there in that map, all the little dots. And depending on how you look at it, it's up to 168 sites. What we see, or what we predict, is that with warming, these systems might actually get more biodiverse. So the rest of the planet, we're thinking about loss of biodiversity for various reasons. In the Arctic, as things warm, the conditions for the growth of many plants will increase. So we might lose a few species, but we should gain more species than we lose over time as warming progresses. So we analyze that with the data to date. And instead, we find a distribution centered on zero. So in this figure, if you're on the positive side, those are the sites and the plots where things are increasing. If you're on the negative side, they're decreasing. And that distribution is centered right on zero. So at the moment, we're not seeing that increase in biodiversity that we expect. But there's some caveats here. Tundra plants are perennial species. they're very long-lived. Some of the species in these plots would be decades, maybe 100 years old or more. They're often clonal, so that we're only capturing a little part of perhaps quite a large, say, shrub clone. There's a lot of dynamics of individuals coming and going over time. So it's quite hard to maybe detect a signal of change, given that these data, the monitoring would have started in the 80s or the 90s, or even more recently, depending on the site. So as of yet, we haven't seen change at the biodiversity level, but nested within this change, or nested within the signal, we are seeing change. So I'll chat you through some of that. But another caveat before we get to that is that this is only at that meter squared plot scale. And of course, the tundra biome is a massive part of our planet. So one of the things that we've been working on recently is to just try and enhance some of that monitoring by getting an idea of the biodiversity that's in those landscapes around those plots. And so this is another fun protocol, genuinely more fun, I think, than the point framing, where you get to walk in concentric circles for days around your plots, and then look down at the ground and jot down every plant species that you see that you have not detected in the plots. And then we compare that sort of regional species pool, that landscape scale of biodiversity, to what we found inside the plots. And what we're seeing, and we're doing this at sites around the Arctic, so this time 35 sites, and we've got different sort of species pools at these different sites. So some sites are more species rich, others are more species poor, and the relationship as you move with distance from those plots out into the landscape, how the biodiversity accumulates varies across plots. But in general, what we're finding is that comparing the plot scale to that landscape scale being 100 meters around the plot, so still quite localized, there are on average 24 species in the landscape that have never been detected inside the plots through this long-term monitoring. So there is a lot of biodiversity surrounding these plots that at some point could invade into those plots, and in some cases is invading into the plots. Because remember, half that distribution we do see increases, and the other half we see decreases. And so then we wondered, what are the traits of those species outside of the plots, and the ones that are entering into the plots? What's going on with those ones? And I could tell a very long story about that, so I'm going to compress it down to just one slide. And the basic story here is that species gained within the plots, and I'm not even showing the evidence for this, but also the species within the landscape often tend to be taller plant species. So the species that we're gaining over time are increasing the canopy height of these plant communities. And now we're trying to enhance that monitoring in other ways too. And I won't tell a scientific story about this, but just to say we're getting out there with hyperspectral sensors to look beyond the visible light spectrum to ask other questions about plants. So from the hyperspectral sensors, you can get some information about plant conditions, say things like the nitrogen in the leaves, but you can also discriminate between different species using that imagery. So it's a potential way to scale beyond just the plot scale and the landscape scale up to a much broader scale, because they are now starting to put these hyperspectral sensors on satellite platforms, and we can also put them on planes and fly aerial surveys. So trying to get to a better understanding of biodiversity across these tundra landscapes and how it might be changing. And here's us in the field lab doing some spectral measurements on some moss here, and then also doing trait measurements to link to those spectral measurements. And you can see we're working on a mattress because it's very high-tech lab conditions up there. So I wanted to delve a little bit into that shrubification signal, that increase in shrubs that I was telling you about. So the next section of the talk will delve into that. So we've been looking at the different lines of evidence for shrubs in tundra biomes for a while now, at least, let's say, 10, 15 years. And what we're seeing is that there is a signal of shrubification across the tundra coming from multiple lines of evidence. So I talked to you a bit about the ecological monitoring and looking at plots over time, but we can also look at other lines of evidence. So we could look at historical ecology using repeat photographs. I'll give you an example there in a bit here. We can use remote sensing techniques because some of these shrub species are quite large and you can detect them from satellites or from aerial imagery. We can use the growth rings in these woody species to look at how their growth patterns have changed over time. And so taken together, those data suggest an increase in shrubs across the tundra biome. And this is a map showing a literature review, and each of the green circles are studies that indicate an increase in shrubs. The brown circles are decreases, and the X's are where no particular change is going on. So the vast majority of studies show an increase, but of course there could be a publication bias here. So we've been talking about and thinking about whether shrubs, which are kind of the trees of the tundra biome that are found beyond the latitudinal and elevational tree line, would be the ones that would respond most rapidly to climate change. And so it could be that we go out and have that lens when we look at these systems, and we have confirmation bias in what we're finding. So that ecological monitoring work that we're doing with the long-term plots gives us a much less biased perspective of change that's going on. And I just wanted to make the quick point that this shrubification signal is not just an Arctic thing. So we tend to, for whatever reason, call them shrubs in the Arctic and call them, I don't know, woody cover in savanna ecosystems. The difference between a shrub and a tree, we could discuss that at the wine session afterwards, but woody biomass is increasing in a variety of different biomes across the planet, including the savanna, including grasslands, and also within the understory canopy of forests. So as things warm, as there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, shrubs do seem to be doing better across the planet. So now I want to show you a specific example of what that evidence for shrubification looks like. And this is again from the Qeqertark field site that I work at. And this is a photograph from 1986 or 87, I've put 87 up there, from when they established the park and they were doing vegetation surveys. And so we found the photograph in a photo album showing the importance of archiving, and thought, we know where that place is on the landscape. And so back during my PhD, my field assistant and I went back to find the exact angle of that photo, and we've been taking the photo ever since. So get this landscape in your mind, and I'm going to flip ahead in time to 2009. And you can start to see a change happening right away. And now keep sort of viewing. This is 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018 coming up, 2019, and then little gap for the pandemic back in 2022, and then here is this summer in 2023. And at least when I look at those photographs, I see pretty dramatic vegetation change. And I really like having the photographic record. Unfortunately, there's only a few of these photographs we could find within the landscape, but it does sort of give me some confidence that, so we have the long-term monitoring data and it's showing this shrubification signal, and the photographs show the shrubification signal. I want to see multiple lines of evidence before I really believe how dramatic the change actually is. And since it's the Linnean Society and I have Carl Linnaeus looking down upon me from this portrait, I wanted to just spend a little bit of time in this talk thinking about the wonderful world of willows. So I don't know if there are any willow fans in the room or online, but I have become a willow fan having worked in these tundra ecosystems, because so willows are the most abundant of the shrubs in the region where I work, in the Yukon Territory. They're the most diverse. There's so many cool things about them, but I'll just show you a few slides. So this is a recent tree of life for just a handful of the very many willow species that are out there. Willows are a very diverse taxa, one of the most diverse in high latitudes, but also in the Northern Hemisphere in general. There are a few Southern Hemisphere willow species, but it's not a big deal in the Southern Hemisphere as a taxa. But they are very tricky because they do not barcode, so you can't, it's been a challenge to build any sort of phylogenetic tree. So these are full genome sequencing to create the tree. So it's only, I think, 40-ish species here, and none of the Arctic ones that I love. But great to see that work is progressing in this way. I basically have samples in a freezer that have been sitting there for 10 years waiting for full genome sequencing to be cheaper so that I can start working on these kind of relationships in the tundra willows. And you can see at the bottom there, poplar, which is their very closely related taxa. So they're diverse. They also hybridize with each other, which is perhaps not surprising, helping to create some of that diversity. And so this is a hybrid willow from the, I believe it's from the Edinburgh Botanic Gardens. So you can zoom on in there. Lots of the willow species hybridize with each other, and those hybrids can reproduce. And yeah, so it's really more the species concept doesn't hold terribly well when you think about willows. Okay, willows are also dioecious, but they also can have individuals with both sexes expressed on the same plant. And these are a couple of examples from my fieldwork from back in the day. It's pretty rare. I would say like maybe 1 in 1 to 2,000 species would show this, but multiple species here. So it's kind of cool. I think you're used to sort of going out and being able to be like, it's a female willow, it's a male willow, and then suddenly you come across one and think, I don't know, that branch is female, that branch is male, this catkin is both. Cool things to do with sex determination in willows too. Willows are also often, though not always, polyploid, and they're part of the reason why there's more polyploidy at high latitudes, as shown in this recent map here. And they form all levels, or I don't know about all, but many different levels of ploidy. So their genome gets replicated in certain species and multiple times. And so that helps to make doing genetic work on them even more challenging as well. So because they can have these really massive genomes. And they also have different phenology, which is something as an ecologist I care about. So the timing of when they leaf out, when they flower, when they set seed can vary a lot between different species, all growing in the same environment. So they clearly over time have evolved different strategies to dealing with, in my case, these high latitude ecosystems. And so this is just an example of some of the species that are found at the sites in which I work, and the fact that their timing of flowering varies. So June is the very beginning of the summer, July is kind of the peak of the growing season, and you have different species flowering all across that period. And they're either taking the strategy of flowering before they even bother to put out leaves so that they can get the pollen dispersal over with, and then their seed set is going to happen at the peak of plant productivity when the weather's the best, and their seeds can probably get the farthest, and they're often air blown. Or they take the other strategy, which is they do the pollen dispersal at the peak of the growing season when the weather's the best, and then their pollen, which is also often windborne, though not necessarily, can get dispersed at that time, and then the poor seed dispersal for the Salix glauca happens just as autumn is coming, and they can, if you have a snowstorm at that point, that's it, your seeds are going nowhere. So risky strategies on either side, and then there's a bunch of species that go for sort of hedging their bets, falling somewhere in between. Cool, so that brings us to I want to now talk a bit about the phenology in general for tundra ecosystems. We'll move away from our willow specific slides there and just think about how warming in these tundra ecosystems is influencing things. And so at the Kikiktark site, this is a view of the place where we stay, the settlement area when we're at the site. This site, the spring is on average getting about 1 week earlier per decade, and across the Arctic as a whole, we're seeing this earlier signal and also a later signal in terms of the ice-free season. So the sea ice and the snow is melting off earlier and it's returning later. So you have this longer period in which plants could exploit these tundra environments and continue to grow. And I'm very curious about how the timing of plant growth is responding to that change, not just in the temperatures, but in the timing of when snow leaves these systems and comes back. And again, these are data that, in terms of what we're analyzing, is very much a collaborative approach. So the long-term phenology data at this site have been collected by the park rangers rather than ourselves as a research team and working together on some of these questions. But in recent years, what we've been trying to do is add other systems into the mix to get higher temporal resolution data. So we've been putting up time-lapse cameras across these landscapes at the Kikiktark site, but also at other sites around the Arctic where we have colleagues working. And the time-lapse cameras are great. They take a photograph as often as you want, but we often do sort of maybe 4 times a day. So you get this very, very continuous understanding of how plants are changing. The only caveat is that muskox and grizzly bears are not fans, and they will just knock them over. So all this summer we were running around, putting them back up again, come back 3 days later, knocked over. They go for certain cameras and not others. So overall, I think we had 35 of them out there. We got some good data in the end. And here is a little video from one of those time-lapse cameras showing that really short growing season that you see in Arctic ecosystems. And this Kikiktark site is at 70 degrees north, so it's kind of in the southern part of the tundra biome. Show it to you just one more time if it lets me. Oh, it might not. But in these imagery, you can see the flowers flowering, you can see the leaves growing, and you can see the tundra ecosystem start to turn yellow in the beginning of August when summer is basically over on Kikiktark. So with this expanding data set of in situ records of plant phenology plus phenocams, where we have a very high resolution understanding of what's going on, we had a bunch of predictions about what might be going on as these ecosystems warm. So possibility one is that as things warm and the ice-free period increases, the plants exploit that longer potential period of growth and grow for longer. The productivity is higher in those systems, and that could be happening both above ground in leaves and below ground in the root systems. Alternatively, we could just be seeing a shift of the growing season earlier. So we know that the growing seasons are starting earlier, but it's possible that due to sort of deterministic ages of the leaves and resources of plants, that they might also end their growing season earlier. So everything just moves earlier, but you don't necessarily see a longer growing season and perhaps not more productivity. And then the third hypothesis that we had is that above ground, we could be seeing that earlier growing season, but below ground, the root systems could exploit the thawed soils that are remaining thawed for longer and thawing to deeper levels than ever before, releasing more nutrients, et cetera. So some of our understanding of how plants might respond under those conditions would suggest that the below ground part of the system might respond differently from what's going on above ground. So we've been working away on testing that. And I'll show you the data for bud burst in one of the willow species, Salix arctica, at the Kikiktark site, just to give you a feel for what that kind of change looks like. So you've got day of year, so the timing of the bud burst on the y-axis there, and as you move down the graph here, you are getting earlier, and up the graph is later. I always get confused by this one. So as we move through time, you can see on average the bud burst is happening earlier and earlier, but there's a lot of variability. There are early years and late years all the way through. And now moving to that tundra biome scale, we've done data synthesis, this time of experimental warming at these sites. So where we've placed these open top warming chambers and looked at how the tundra responds with that passive warming. And what we see in terms of plant phenology is that the growing season, which is sort of indicated in the middle of this slide with the different pictures of green up and flowering and senescence, that growing season with the experimental warming data suggests that things are shifting earlier, and certain phenophases, in particularly the flowering phenophases, are moving earlier, such that the flowering season is actually getting shorter over time. But this is experimental evidence, so what we're trying to put together now is the change over time side of the story. Unfortunately, I don't have the final results for that yet, but if you want to chat afterwards about the preliminary results, I'll give you a feel in the next couple slides. And I just wanted to also flip over to another type of experimental approach that we could take to getting an understanding of how tundra plants are growing differently and how their phenology might be changing, and that's with common garden experiments. So this is a common garden that we've been running in the Yukon territory, and it's got willows in it, my favorite. It's got 3 different species from alpine areas in the southern Yukon and Arctic coastal tundra, and those 2 sites are about 1,000 kilometers apart. And the idea was to have a reciprocal transplant experiment. Unfortunately, we only got the funding to do the southern part of it. So it's willows moving south and willows moving down the hill into a boreal forest environment, and been looking at how they grow. And again, I could tell you a much longer story about this, but I'm going to focus on the phenology side of things and just say that one of the interesting things that happens when you move a willow 1,000 kilometers south is that the phenological timing changes. So here we are in June, and the plant is looking pretty green, but now we're hitting towards the end of June, and it's now just early July, and things are senescing. So they basically have a really strong adaptation to photoperiod, and just being in a southern location where the days are not 24-hour sunlight confuses the plant enough that it stops growing in the beginning of July. So we do see, as you could imagine, pretty strong differences between the Arctic willow in the front there and the alpine willows that you can kind of see in the background of this video, in part because of that photoperiod adaptation. So it's interesting to ponder, if we just move these species all around, if we transplanted southern willows in a very northern location, they might get quite confused. But why does changing plant phenology matter? And so I could tell you many reasons, but just to touch on a few of the wildlife reasons, let's talk about caribou. This is actually a picture of a reindeer, but from Fennoscandia. Okay, so remember this graph. This is the data from Kikiktark Island. And you've got 2 years here, one that had bud burst pretty much in late May, and one that had bud burst in late June. So a month apart, an early year and a late year in this time series. And there are caribou populations that migrate through this area, and this is the area where they have their calving grounds. And Indigenous people, the Inuvialuit, know that the timing of caribou migration is very closely tied to the timing of plant growth. And so this is a quote from a member of one of the Inuvialuit communities. You know, it's just a matter of timing of things. You know, everything being early or later in spring, it depends on how far the caribou make it before they start to calve. And so now there are satellite collar data on some of those caribou individuals, and we can look at where they go in different years. And those 2 years, so the early spring of 2015, the caribou migration brought them all the way, that line is the Yukon-Alaska border, into the Alaskan Arctic, into the Anwar region, which has very much been in the news recently, where there's the oil development, part of their main calving grounds. But in the late spring, they calved on the Yukon side of the border. And so that brought the animals to, you know, these are, I don't know, what's that? Something like 300-400 miles apart. So quite different parts of the Arctic, different countries, closer or farther away from different Indigenous communities in this region. And that difference was in part due to the timing of plant growth in those early versus late years. And there's also all sorts of implications for pollinating insects. And if you imagine these heterogeneous tundra environments with the snow patches melting off earlier, then that means that flowering time will be more homogeneous across those landscapes. And so that's probably bad news for something like a bumblebee that is relying on different plants flowering at different times across the summer to get nectar resources. So now I want to flip from the above ground to the below ground in these systems and think about what might be happening in terms of the phenological timing below ground. And so we've been running around in tundra ecosystems, digging little cores of the tundra out to replace that little chunk of tundra with peat moss from the garden center in a lovely tube to make a root ingrowth core experiment. So here's sort of the protocol. You put 3 ingrowth cores of different depths, and you have to put different depths because in these systems, as the summer progresses, the permafrost is below, and what we call the active layer, the thawed part of the ground, progressively thaws down as the summer progresses, and we want to be able to remove these cores at different times to look at when plant roots are growing. If we try to remove a long core at the beginning of the summer, it will be very much frozen in the ground, so that will not be possible. So this is the protocol, and we've been getting our colleagues to implement it at sites around the tundra biome, both in the Arctic and in alpine areas. And we're madly working away on analyzing the data, but here we are collecting one of the cores, and we never managed to put in the effort to get sponsorship from Pringles, but we have used so many Pringles tubes. They're the perfect thing for storing your root cores, but the only downside is you have to eat a lot of Pringles. So if you're ever out with us in the field, you will get many tubes of Pringles foisted upon you. And alongside this work, we've been using drones and other tools to measure the microclimate environments where these root cores are located, sensors like these TOMP sensors, so we have an understanding of the temperatures and the soil moisture. And previous research using similar approaches has shown that in the subarctic, or the very edges of the tundra biome, growing seasons below ground can be 50% longer than above ground. So this is a nice sort of schematic. So the above ground part is the white bar, the below ground part is the gray bar, and you can just see how much longer the below ground parts of the very same plot of tundra can grow into September. And so if we go back to our hypotheses, these three. I think the preliminary results very much suggest that this below ground decoupling hypothesis is probably what is going on in these systems. So we're having somewhat of a compression of at least the flowering part of the growing season as things warm above ground, and below ground, the root data to date suggests that indeed they are able to grow in that later into the season. It's tricky with root data because we don't have the same sort of time series component. We don't have data collected over time, but that's the sort of implications are in this direction. And that matters because 80% of tundra biomass is actually below ground. And so this is just a photograph of myself and two of my students, and we've dug up this shrub here, another willow, and we were sort of, as we were digging out, following the root networks outwards, and they broke off at a certain point. So the root networks extended well beyond this, but that's maybe like, I don't know, 5 to 10 meters of root networks around a 50 centimeter diameter shrub individual. So it just gives you a feel for how much is happening below ground. And there's all sorts of important ecosystem functions that these tundra plants provide, that layer of green above those permafrost soils. So the canopies can trap snow in the wintertime, providing a sort of insulating blanket that keeps the soil temperatures warmer, which could be a positive feedback to further permafrost thaw. The shrubs themselves can stick up above the snowpack and darken the soil surface, which in spring, when there's a lot of solar radiation, these systems can bring more heat into the system. And all of these factors may create sort of feedbacks to what's going on in the Arctic. So to get at what might be going on in the soil with plant litter being deposited in those soils, we carried out an experiment. And the botanists in the room might have a guess at what plant this is. Any thoughts? I've hidden the informational sign so you can't cheat. As a British audience, I would hope. It's tea, yes. So this is the Tundra tea bag experiment. So now I have another question for you in the room. So we use two types of tea, a green tea and a rooibos tea. So if you know your tea types, I want you to guess, we'll maybe do a little hands up in the room here. Which of those two teas is going to decompose faster, both in a tundra environment and probably anywhere in the world if you bury them in the ground at about 8 to 10 centimeters depth? Okay, so you've got your rooibos tea and your green tea. Ready to vote? Okay, hands up for the green tea decomposing faster. Okay, for people on Zoom, we have 4 subtle hands. Maybe 5, maybe 5. Okay, so now the rooibos tea vote. Now I'm seeing 6, 7 subtle hands. Some people are choosing not to vote. Oh no, 8. Okay, so we've got more rooibos voters than green tea voters. And what is rooibos tea? Oh, well, so it's a red tea, very popular in the southern part of Africa. But yes, knowing something about these two plants and possibly like how tea is processed might help you answer this question. So people who know the tea types, could we have one person from the green tea camp tell us why green tea should decompose faster and not rooibos tea? And one person from the rooibos camp? Quickly, shout out.
So caffeine is slowing the rate of decomposition.
Okay, good hypothesis. So there's caffeine only in the green tea, not in the rooibos tea. That could slow decomposition. Okay, someone from the other. So no thoughts? Nothing. Oh, fascinating. Okay. How is green tea produced relative to black tea? Like, what's the difference between green tea and black tea? It's the tip, and then I know that my high school friend Wendy in the audience has worked for a tea company, and she knows full well. Anyhow, I will let you in on the secret. The black tea is fermented a bit, so it's gone through a bit of the decomposition process, which is kind of a hint. So the people who said green tea faster, you guys have won. The rooibos people, you have lost. Because green tea it's a much more soft, fleshy leaf, and it just decomposes faster. And if you knew more about the rooibos plant, it's got quite a needle leaf shaped leaf that's quite tough and hard to decompose. But the point of this long diversion is that what we're finding with the teabag experiment is that as things warm, we can sometimes see an increase in the more decomposable litter types in these systems because those plant species with more decomposable leaves are increasing. And so what we think might be going on with decomposition is that the vegetation change, the biotic mechanisms leading to decomposition change in these systems are bigger, are stronger than the direct climatic effects of the Arctic warming and that warming the soil temperatures. So just to give you a feel that there's a lot of complexity at play and a kind of fun anecdote that some tea bags dug into the ground at many sites around the tundra biome can give you some insight into those processes. Cool, so, but back to why should we care? Just a reminder that about a quarter of the northern hemisphere is underlain by permafrost. So the tundra biome and the boreal forest biomes are very big. And about a third of the world's soil carbon is stored within those two biomes at high latitudes. And so here's a map, and this shows the vulnerability of soil carbon to thaw. And you can see the place where there's the most soil carbon on this planet that's vulnerable to being lost as things warm are at these high latitudes. And those same feedbacks that I talked about on the previous slide of vegetation change, changing the reflectance of the tundra and the permafrost thaw, the nutrient cycling, the carbon storage, could all create relatively large feedbacks to climate change by releasing that carbon from these systems. And so I wanted to finish the talk on a, let's say, a low point here, talking about how much permafrost thaw change is going on at the site that I work at. So I started the talk with that picture or that video of the retrogressive thaw slump. So here we are back at the same thaw slump looking down in a photograph in 2019. And I've indicated some arrows on that sort of mark out places within the landscape I want you to focus on, because I'm going to show you what this thaw slump looks like this summer in 2023. And the angle is going to shift slightly. So you need to sort of have the arrows there to orient yourself. So this is 2019. And then that's 2023. So I don't know if you can sort of spot the differences there. Maybe we'll run through it one more time. That thaw slump is about 2 kilometers across. So this is a very big landscape feature. That ice cliff that you saw in the first clip is about 40 meters tall. It's big. There's a lot of carbon being lost. And that brings up the idea of sort of tipping points in these ecosystems and whether we're crossing a threshold in the Arctic from which it's going to be quite hard to come back from if you're a tundra plant, perhaps, and maybe a person on this planet thinking about the carbon cycle. And so in this summer in 2023, it was an El Nino year and it was abnormally warm across the planet, but that was also very much true in the Arctic and particularly in the Western Arctic where I was working. So you see, this is a map of the July temperature anomaly looking down on the top of the planet. And you see that red patch at where Alaska meets Canada. That's where I was working. So it was at 12 degrees warmer than the average in the 90s, just to give you a feel, way warmer. And to give you another metric, you can go swimming in the ocean at this site. Normally, it's like quite a painful experience. On the hottest day, we were able to stay in the water for 2 hours because it was 25, 26 degrees, and it just felt very surreal. And so that warming led to a new type of permafrost thaw happening at the site. So this is an active layer detachment. So it's when the surface active layers have reached the maximum thaw depth, it's probably the maximum thaw depth in thousands of years. There's a lot of water at that level within the soil profile. The water melts and that lubricates the top of the soils. And so wherever you have any topography and anything's unstable, then the soil just starts ripping off and coming down the slope, and in this case, going straight into the ocean. And it's really hard to give a feel for the volumes of soil we're talking about here, but at the bottom is a beach, and on the beach, there are some driftwood from the Mackenzie River Delta. So those are trees. So you just give you a feel. So a person would be quite small in this image. So that's something that was going on, and I just want to summarize where we got to in the talk, and then I'm going to finish the permafrost thaw story at the very end to leave you on that point. So what are the tundra plant responses to warming? In the talk, we've talked about how shrubs are increasing in these ecosystems. biodiversity is predicted to change with increasing plant species richness and many other changes besides. The composition of these tundra communities are changing as well. We're seeing a shift in plant phenology. The growing seasons are getting earlier above ground, and probably below ground, the plants are able to grow for longer into those thawed permafrost soils. So you get this sort of decoupling of what's happening above ground and below ground as things warm, which is quite interesting to think about when you start to think about what impacts that would have on other trophic levels. And you've got other types of change going on in these systems. It's not just about warming, it's about the indirect change through permafrost thaw and changing nutrient cycling, et cetera, that are ultimately directly influencing plants as well. And so we might think of climate as a driver of change in these systems as a very sort of simple, it warms, the plants respond, and that's the kind of stuff that we're seeing out there. But it's really this complex web of many different indirect drivers, all leading to the types of change that we're seeing, and trying to isolate which drivers are the most important and how those are changing over time is quite a challenge. So it brings us back to the active layer detachments of this summer. So now we're looking at that same landscape from a slightly different angle down at these two river valleys, the same ones where I showed you the repeat photographs and the shrubification of willows. And I want to zoom in on this box here, and just to point out, those are the active layer detachments all across this landscape. There were tens, maybe hundreds of them across the landscape by the time we left in the middle of August. And here is two of the interns on our research team jumping over the active layer detachment at this site. And if you zoom in further into this plot and you look closely, you can see a popsicle stick. So that is one of the long-term phenology monitoring plots that the rangers have been monitoring since 1999. And unfortunately, there are 3 transects and we lost 2 of them completely. So that data set is no more. So it really is a challenge, I think, for all of us working in these systems, plant ecologists who are trying to understand how these systems are responding to change when we're actually losing the data sets and being challenged by even moving across these landscapes by the climate change that is what the plants are responding to. So it's a really interesting place to be as a climate change ecologist, to think about how my job of trying to document the change is getting harder as the change progresses. So perhaps not the most happy ending for this talk, but just to let you know, shrubs come back in with a permafrost disturbance relatively quickly. They're very good at taking advantage of freshly disturbed systems. So who knows, if you're a shrub fan, this could be quite a beautiful shrubby green landscape again, relatively soon. We will see. So I'll end the talk there. Thank you very much to everyone in the room and also to everyone online. I'd be very happy to answer any questions, and it's been a pleasure to chat to you today. Thank you. Right, any questions in the room? So we got 2 at the back there in the black sweater.
So the change you're mentioning is very rapid, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
How long do you think those kind of biodiversity pockets will last, given that the change so rapidly and losing so much, land and things?
Yeah, so the question is, the change you're talking about is very rapid. How much do you think, and correct me if I'm wrong here, the sort of increasing biodiversity signal might last when you're also losing parts of the landscape to disturbance? Great question. I think one of the things that we're really trying to grapple with at the moment are scale questions in this type of work. So a lot of the previous work really focused down on the plot scale. And then there's also been, which I didn't really talk today about, a lot of work done at the satellite remote sensing scale, showing this greening of tundra systems from space, but at very, very coarse resolutions. And much of the action is actually happening between those 2 scales. So you might lose your long-term plots to a permafrost thaw disturbance, but you might just end up having those plots in the right part of the landscape where they don't experience that direct change. And from the satellite perspective, you might have permafrost thaw disturbances within your giant satellite pixel, but you might not really detect the specifics of what's happening on the ground and how the plants are responding. So trying to bridge those 2 scales, I think, will be key to figuring out the mechanisms and magnitudes of change. That's partially where some of the drone work comes in, so we can get really high resolution data, but that's high spatial resolution. We can't easily get the temporal resolution. Also, these systems are kind of hard to work in. It can rain, it can be very windy, and you can't fly your drones. So I think there's still a lot of questions that remain. At that particular site, it is one of the most ice-rich parts of the tundra biome. So it's the place where you would expect to see this really dramatic permafrost thaw response. I was very surprised that it started to unfold this summer. I thought we had a decade or more to go before that kind of level of change would be seen, but I think that's the thing about tipping points, is they usually do surprise you, even though you know they should come at some point. But I think that site is going to be on the more dramatic end of things. A lot of tundra sites are still underlain by permafrost, but the permafrost is in bedrock, so they should be able to be more resilient to warming, because it won't lead to that sort of ice-rich permafrost thaw. So that doesn't really answer your question, apart from to say it's the thing we're grappling with, for sure. At the back.
I just want to say thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, what were your thoughts about like the change in technology, and how does that help you? Is it easier? Has it made it harder? And you mentioned about like other animals and wildlife with the cameras, but what are your thoughts about the advancing technology?
Great question. I'm very excited about how technology can take us to new places with this research. So the time-lapse camera work, I mean, it's not really new technology, that's been around for a while, but it allows us to have this like very continuous understanding of like every moment in a plant's life, which is really exciting. And then the drones give us like such high resolution data. You can see each plant leaf, and the drone is like 50 meters in the air. They do come with their challenges, as you heard in the talk. So the time-lapse camera challenge is try to battle the wildlife to keep them standing. The drone challenges are the weather and the technology and the drone breaking, and many, many challenges. I think it's worth the struggle in the field because the data sets are amazing, but then there's more challenges once you get those data back to your computer or your lab at the university, because those data sets are massive. And so now we're trying to ask the same statistical questions with much more complex data sets. So then that brings us into potentially the whole world of using artificial intelligence types approaches to extract the signal from those kind of complex data sets. So many challenges, but also a really exciting place to be, because I think we're going to start to get the answers to questions that we wouldn't have been able to answer without these new technologies. I think we're still before that point where we've really made the technological advance, in the sense that we've got the technologies out collecting the data, but we haven't really figured out how to best exploit that data to answer the questions we have. So you're a young person, maybe you're going to be the one who gets us across that threshold, or hopefully, my team and others in the coming years. So I think we're at a very exciting point where we're going to be able to answer the really key climate change questions. Thank you.
So, as a permafrost melts, we'll start to see ancient viruses and bacteria and things. Will we see ancient plants and see
Okay, so the question, I forgot to repeat the last question, which was, I think the folks on Zoom would have gotten the impression, but how does new technology play a role? And the next question is about ancient plants being thawed out of permafrost systems like ancient viruses and other life might be. So there are ancient plant parts, if you will, coming out of both permafrost thaw and glacial retreat. So for example, at the Ellesmere Island site, and I showed that photograph, literally right there, the glacier is retreating, and beneath that glacier are dead, but very well intact Cassiope tetragona. So it's a mountain white heather, I think would be its common name. Very well preserved. So you can do genetic analyses. You can actually look at the growth increments and ask questions about how those plants grew, and then you can date them many thousands of years in the past. So I have collaborators and colleagues working on that and working with similar samples from the glacial edges at sites around the Arctic. So there's really cool ancient DNA work you can do. There would also be seeds coming out in some of these systems. I don't know that anyone has, as of yet, demonstrated that those seeds are viable, but there still are lots of interesting questions. So that I know there's work where they've looked at the stomach contents of, say, things like mammoths and looked at what's in there, and that's given them an understanding of probably what the mammoth ate, which gives them an indirect understanding of probably what those landscapes look like. There's some issues with that because certain plant species decompose faster, aka the teabag sort of work. So maybe what we're seeing more of in the ancient stomach contents are the things that preserve better, not necessarily the things that were more abundant. But still, if you sort of have your detective hat on, I think you can figure out a lot about these systems in the past, which the Arctic has been warmer in the past. So knowing what has happened in the past will inform our understanding of what's happening now. So I think it's a key part of the story as well. And back to the technology question, new technologies in terms of how we can work with DNA will allow us to extract more and more understanding of the past in these systems to inform our understanding of now and the future. Okay.
If global warming isn't stopped, what happens to the climate? Will it become a totally different ecosystem?
Great question. So the question was, if global warming isn't stopped or slowed, what happens to the tundra? Does it become a totally different ecosystem? So again, if we use our long-term paleo perspective, the locations that are in the Arctic at points have been tropical rainforests. Now they weren't at the northern hemisphere of the planet at that time, but I guess if you have a long time perspective and you let things really warm, the biomes will probably move up and it'll become a forested ecosystem and so on, if other things don't happen in the meantime, which they might. But I think it's a long time off before, say, snow and ice totally disappear from these systems. So to sort of counter that, the sort of dramatic permafrost thaw that I'm showing is a particular context, but there will be very cold winters in the Arctic for many years to come. And even though we might see some responses of plant communities with the sort of colder loving species maybe being disadvantaged and warmer loving species coming in, it's a long time until like a temperate species could really eke out an existence in these systems because they're still pretty extreme places to live. And I think maybe some of the changes we are seeing and might see in future have more to do with things going out of the boundaries of what the current species are evolutionarily adapted to, but rapid evolution might progress. And so some tundra plants might do just fine with the amount of warming that we're seeing. So yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns there and definitely rapid changes coming. And I think one of the things about that accelerating rate of change in the high latitudes is that at this point, even if we stopped or slowed climate change, we're going to see things play out.
Changes from the south to the north already. The south.
Those are some of, so the question was, are we seeing changes from the south to the north of the tundra already? It's tricky because the systems are still responding to the end of the last ice age in terms of the movement of species north. So the species have been moving north and they continue to move north. But one of the questions we're looking at right now is how much of the biodiversity increases that we're seeing in plots close to the boreal forest are boreal forest species moving into tundra ecosystems where they didn't used to live, and also are we seeing increases in the species with larger thermal niches, warmer thermal niches than would be typically found in these systems. So I don't fully have the answer, but yes, I think there are some signals of change that are a south to north type of change, range shifts at play, but they play out slowly. These are perennial long-lived species. Yeah. So, how many more questions should we take? Should we do two more? So there and there. So we do that. Okay.
You mentioned that the flowering season is being compressed.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you think that that's going to increase as well, or what the implications would be.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. So the flowering season, with the experimental data, we see evidence that it's getting shorter. I don't know if I repeated the question, but the question was, what are the, how much more could the flowering season shorten and what would the implications be? At some point, I don't think it can get any shorter. I don't know how close we are to that point, but maybe we could start to figure that out, thinking a bit more about the physiology. And so I think bringing in more of the ecophysiology into the work that we do is going to help to answer some of those questions. And then a little bit on the implication side, I alluded to it a bit in terms of thinking about pollinators in these landscapes. But I think one of the things that will happen is not just shortening, it's becoming more homogeneous across the landscapes. And so you could think about a growing season in these heterogeneous landscapes as being like what happens to an individual plant, but you could also think about it as being like what happens in a square kilometer or something like that. So it's shortening for the individual plant, and it's probably shortening even more, and the same kind of mechanisms are going on at that landscape scale, such that if you're a breeding bird or a pollinating insect, the time in which you can be active and get the resources you need off of those flowers is decreasing in two ways, spatially and temporally. And that's probably going to make your life more challenging. But how much? I think a lot of those questions we haven't answered, but I think back to the technology question, we now have the data sets to answer this question. So an exciting time. Great, and we're one question.
Briefly, thank you for a wonderful talk. I just wondered about the chemistry of the soil and the chemicals being given out and then the methane, etc.
Yeah.
And the change in that. I don't know whether your studies are encompassing that in detail. The second point is about pathogens and fungi and viruses and bacteria being released. And I just wondered, are you liaising with other researchers to look at the broader picture about what's really going on at the micro level, please?
Great. So two questions there. One was on the soil chemistry and what's happening with, say, methane release in these systems. And the second one was about back to sort of the release of potentially pathogens from these systems and microorganisms. So on the first part of the question, most of the tundra biome is organic rich soils. So it really is just sort of plant litter frozen in the ground, with often organic layers underneath, but you have this very thick organic layer. So they tend to be very low in nitrogen, those soils. And depending on where you are, they could or could not be low in phosphorus. It sort of depends on the parent material. But in general, they're not particularly nutrient-rich soils. So one of the questions that we have is, as things warm, will the nutrient limitations become the thing that's holding back plants rather than temperatures? So lots of questions to ask in there. In terms of methane and CO2 coming out of these systems, those permafrost thaw slumps and active layers just becoming deeper are exposing carbon and dead plant material from the past that has been frozen for thousands of years. That does start decomposing. So you do lose carbon by both pathways, methane and CO2, and it depends a bit on how wet those soils are and what microbes are there, what's coming out in which direction. You also, through the disturbances, you lose carbon directly to the ocean, and then it can get processed within the ocean, and then some of that will come up as methane or CO2 depending on the situation. So that is part of that big climate feedback question, is how much of those newly exposed thawed permafrost soils are going to release how much carbon and in what form? Because if it's methane, it's going to have a short-term, more dramatic greenhouse gas effect relative to the CO2. Both are not ideal. And there is a fair bit of carbon that could be released. So if all of the surface soils in those high latitude systems, if the carbon was lost from them, it would more than double the atmospheric concentration of CO2, just to give you a feel. So that would have a very big global impact. Now, I don't think that's happening anytime soon, but maybe on longer timescales, that is a concern that we should have if we aren't going to be able to slow down climate change. And then I'm going to give a very short answer to the last bit, which I'm not directly working on sort of pathogens coming out of soils, but we are interested in the microbial interactions and plant symbioses with, say, fungal communities, et cetera, and how that influences their responses to climate warming. So I have a new PhD student starting who's going to tackle some of those questions. And again, we have to team up with other groups who are experts in that area to bring that piece of the puzzle into the story. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isla. And everybody, just a round of applause for our brilliant speaker this evening.